Howdy everyone, welcome back. We're doing something a bit different today. Very different, not ninth, because fuck it, it's my channel, I'll do whatever I want. I have been trying recently to read more books, because it's sort of something that I've always liked, but just sort of gotten out of the habit of with like easier stuff in life. Like I can watch TV and it's easier than reading a book, because I don't have to concentrate as much. I don't know. But anyway, I'm trying to read more often. And one thing I'm trying to focus on is reading more sci-fi, because I've always sort of been into sci-fi, but I've always read fantasy more than sci-fi itself. Like I watch sci-fi stuff, but haven't really delved into the book side of things very much. So I've got other ones that I am planning to read, but today I'm going to talk about and compare a couple of them, despite the fact that I've got no expertise in this area, and it's just what I reckon. So first one is Dune, which has, I think, out right now, a movie that I'm hearing really good things about and I'm really keen to see. The second one is Hyperion. I don't know if that's how it's pronounced, but it's a weird word and I don't know how to pronounce it. So, Dune I sort of already knew about prior to reading it. Like I haven't watched I think there's an old movie. I haven't watched that. And apparently there's an old TV show and I haven't watched that. But I've always sort of heard of it as sort of like a classic. And I originally bought it just because it had this reputation as like one of the best sci-fi or fantasy books ever written. So that's why I bought it. And then before I read that, I bought a bunch of other books that were theoretically like kind of classic sci-fi books from what I understand. But I only got that information from another YouTube channel called Hello Future Me, who recommended books. So I'm basically just going off his expertise there in terms of if that's actually correct. So I'll talk about Dune first, because it's the book that I read first. Point out first is a big ol' spoilers are probably going to come. I'm going to try and avoid them, but if you haven't read these, want to read them, haven't seen Dune or read Dune, want to read it, maybe don't watch this, because there will be some things inevitably that I talk about that I shouldn't. Okay, and now I'm back. Right, yes, so Dune, read it. I liked it a lot. Basically, it's sort of Star Warsy in its vibe, which I think is a disservice to Dune from what I hear, because apparently Star Wars is Dune-y in its vibe. But it's quite a sort of all-encompassing story, I guess. Whereas some other books are... Oh, we dropped it. Some of the books are more sort of like a micro story within a larger fantasy or sci-fi world. This is more sort of like, this is the one story that's being told. This is the most important thing that's happening. I enjoyed it all the way through. I really kind of didn't. The start of the book, I'm not sure if it's because it was spoiled by the blurb or if it's actually indicated earlier on in the book, because I sort of read a quarter or a third of the way through the book and then wasn't reading it for a while and came back to it, so I can't specifically remember if it was actually inside the story in like that sort of first quarter-ish that it was spoiled. Or not really spoiled, because I think it's somewhat by design, but like quite an important thing happens that I knew was going to happen, and it meant that for the first section of the book I was sort of just sitting there waiting for it to happen. You know, I wasn't looking on excitedly going like, ooh, what's going to happen next? I was like, I know this is going to happen, and everything that happens before then seemingly doesn't matter to me. Like, it didn't seem to matter as much. So I was a little bit bored in the early stages, but once the thing that I knew was going to happen happened, and it was onto things that I didn't know how it was going to go, I enjoyed it. It is like dated. Like, I think this book was written in the 1950s, so you can sort of tell from the style of writing that it's not a modern book. And I think while, again, from things that I've heard, like it's quite an influential book for other sci-fi authors and just works in general. Going back as like from a modern perspective, going back to Dune, having already consumed a lot of other sci-fi content, it doesn't seem as innovative as I think it would have been at the time. So it's a little bit unfair for me to judge it from my perspective when these were probably much more original ideas at the time. It was a cool world. It was a fairly cool story. I found that the characters were a little bit unemotional, and it's kind of by design, based on the world that is being used and that he's created. But it's a little bit hard to empathize with characters who are stilted emotionally. Like, I don't know. It just sort of seemed like a lot of the time the lack of emotion in a lot of characters made them less human, which to me made the story seem a little bit less important. It's sort of like this is just happening to people who aren't like me. Overall, though, I thought it did a really good job of telling like a cohesive, important story in the set of the narrative. Like I didn't feel like what was happening was like either inconsistent or like didn't make sense. It was all very logical the whole way through. It was easy to follow what was happening, and yeah, I think the story basically was it was very clean for what it was. I would say, at least from my perspective, it was a bit like the core story and the sort of path that the characters go on was a bit simple, but I think that in part goes back to the book's age and the fact that like it was one of sort of the first of its kind, if not the first of its kind. So sort of the simple story, I think, was a background for the fantastical sci-fi stuff that was going on. But I do recommend it, actually. If you're interested in this sort of thing, I would read this book because, one, I kind of think it's a little bit like Lord of the Rings, where it's like, it's important that I read this. If I care about reading sci-fi, I should read Dune. It's a little bit like Lord of the Rings in that way for fantasy, in my opinion. Like, if you like reading fantasy, you should read Lord of the Rings, even if... Because Lord of the Rings is a bit dated as well. I really like Lord of the Rings, and I like reading it, but it's got some of the same issues where you sort of like... You feel its age when you read it, but I think that you should still read it if it's the sort of thing that interests you. It's good, and I recommend it. Hyperion, also good. Different vibe. It is, it's doing the same thing where it's sort of telling, like, the one important story. I'm trying to think of a good example of something, like, other than that, in a sci-fi setting, but I can't really... I guess, easiest or most well-known that I know of would be like the Firefly series on TV. Not like before the movie. The movie was sort of like the one important story that was going on, whereas the TV series was more like we're following the paths of these characters who we're interested in as they interact with this interesting universe that we've created. And the characters are interesting, the motivations are interesting, the backgrounds are interesting, and our world is interesting, but there's a lot more going on, a lot more important things happening that these characters have no control over. They might be affected by it, but they're not core drivers in it, whereas the movie, they sort of become core drivers in that more important narrative. So yeah, Hyperion, like Dune, is the same, in my opinion, where it's sort of the events of the book are the most important story happening in the universe. They have grand implications, and it's, the importance of what is happening in the book isn't just to the characters who are in it, it's to the entire world that the book is presenting to you. The basic sort of format of the book is you've got a group of 7 companions on a journey, they've sort of been brought together for this journey. They didn't know each other previously. And the book is told as they go on their journey, and the bulk of the actual story and the writing in the book is more like their flashback stories. They each have a dedicated flashback story that is the way the story is more told than what is actually going on their journey. It's more sort of like everything that has led them to the point is the important thing, not so much the final journey that they're going on. In terms of like what you're consuming and how you're feeling about the book, that's what I mean by it's the most important thing to the story. It was interesting because it worked well into like relatively well mixing these these 6 or 7 stories that were very different stylistically, and their content was very different. But Dan Simmons did a good job of joining it together so that they all made sense together, even though like you could basically take like at least 3 of them that I'm thinking of off the top of my head, and you would say they are different genres of story. But he's managed to bring them all together quite well, which is something that is generally surprising in books, I find. Like, if you're trying to do a similar thing and you're trying to tell very different stories in one book, usually they end up feeling a bit disjointed. But he's done a much better job of each story contributing to the overall narrative that we're sort of going towards. So while we don't focus as much on the physical actions in the journey these characters are going on, we're learning a lot about the journey they're going on, why they're going on it, and all the implications for the world based on these flashback stories that are being told. I don't think that all of the stories are as good as each other, I guess. So a little bit disappointing for me in that when I read the first flashback story, I was like, this is great. This is exactly the kind of story that I want to read. I am so into it. So it was a little bit disappointing for me to then go to the later ones. Even the ones that I particularly liked, it was like, it's not quite the same. I just want more of that first thing. So particularly I think the second or the third... I don't know, I can't remember. No, yeah, the third story I was sort of like I'm really not that into this, to be honest. But by the same token, it was sort of like, I'm interested in the story, and I'm not as interested in this particular part of it, but I know that it's not the only part of the book. So, if the whole book had been told and was of a similar style to the third flashback story, I wouldn't have been interested, but given that it was 50 or 60 or 70 pages of this book, I was like, I'm still learning more about the thing that I am interested in the story, even if this particular way of telling I'm not quite as keen on, basically. I think comparing the two books, Dune probably sort of tells a grander story. Like, although they're both telling, as I've sort of tried to describe it, and isn't a great term for it, but like the most important story in their world, Dune tells one that is more grand, more far-reaching. Well, maybe not more far-reaching, but it feels more like the story of Dune is, I don't know. It feels more like Dune actually encompasses the whole world, whereas Hyperion is sort of more of like you know that this is the most important story and the most important thing happening, but it's kind of the fact of that importance isn't quite as important to the book. And I feel like that's a really bad way of explaining it, but if anybody's read both of these, you might understand what I mean, and if you haven't, well, just ignore me while I ramble at some parts of this. I liked Hyperion better. I enjoyed it more than Dune. I think just because I think it was like 1978. It's in the front here somewhere. 1989. So it's a much more recent book, because if I look at Dune. No, I'm not sure when this one was made, but I got the 50th anniversary edition, and I don't know. It says copyright 1965, so maybe there's like 25 years of difference between the books. I don't really know, but it's like Hyperion is definitely more modern than Dune, and it definitely builds on a greater sort of sci-fi background than Dune was able to, because Dune was establishing a lot of that. But for me personally, I found that Hyperion was more interesting. The characters were more relatable because they were more emotional. And the style of writing was more like modern books that I'm used to, I guess. So it was easier for me to get engrossed in the story a bit, I think. If I was going to make recommendations, I would say that if you're looking to read like sci-fi classics, you'd have to start with Dune as more important than Hyperion. Like, it just... I don't even know what it is, because I haven't read or heard that much about it, but even just sort of reading it, I just sort of felt its influence, in terms of like knowing that it was one of the earlier books of its time, or sci-fi books of its time, I should say. It was sort of like I did feel that I was like, okay, like, while this doesn't seem novel to me, I can recognize that this was most likely very novel and innovative at the time for someone to come up with an idea like this. So if you're basically going like, I want to read classic sci-fi books because I don't know enough about them, but I love Star Wars or something. Like, if you love Star Wars, frankly, Dune is a better Star Wars. I've seen all the Star Wars movies, but I don't think they're actually that great, personally. And Dune, to me, is just a better story. I haven't seen the movie, but if the movie is anything like the book, I expect the movie to be better than any Star Wars movie that's ever been made, personally. Not to disparage the fact that, like, Star Wars was, like, you know, big, successful sci-fi movie in a similar way. Like, I think it had an impact probably on sci-fi films that Dune had on sci-fi fiction. I think it's a better story. So if you're someone who likes sci-fi, but you haven't sort of delved into the classics, I would recommend Dune for sure. And that's the reason why I started reading it. So, if you're just sort of like, hey, I haven't read either of these books, I like sci-fi, Max, which one should I read? I would say Hyperion. It's more modern, it's easier to get into, and in my opinion, it's more interesting. It's my preference of the two books. But realistically, I enjoyed both of them. So if you haven't read either of them and you're keen, I would suggest giving both of them a go. It's just that, personally, Hyperion was sort of more my style. That's basically it. That's all I really wanted to talk about. I just had thoughts on these two books, and wanted to get them out. Oh, one thing I didn't remember is that, so if you think about Hyperion as being this sort of, the characters are telling each other these stories throughout the story. So their flashbacks are actually them conveying, like, the reason why going to the planet Hyperion is important to them. And it was just sort of like one of those books that's like weirdly sexually descriptive. Like, when they talk about sex happening and stuff, they're always like describing like, oh, like, and then I kissed her under the left breast. Also describes a lot more women than men, which is just sort of like, makes me feel like I know what Dan Simmons was more interested in. But it a little bit took me out of the narrative to be like, reading these stories and thinking about the fact that there's a guy up there in front of 6 or 7 other people going, so then we'll run. Like, I feel like if I was telling these stories to a group of people that I barely knew, even if it's a deeply personal story, I wouldn't describe, like, act for act, what I was doing while I was having sex. I would just sort of be like, yep, and so we made love, or probably wouldn't even go into that, to be honest. I would just fade to black even as like a storytelling thing of just going, like, yeah, and then, you know, we retired. So, anyway, that was a little bit weird, which I don't remember having in Dune. But, yeah, both books, good books, would recommend you read them. And I don't know what I'm going to do in later times on my channel, but maybe more of this. Probably still some Ninth Age stuff. Maybe weirdly completely different stuff. Who knows? It's my channel, I do what I want. Goodbye.